Okay guys, welcome back. I managed to simulate 40 frames in total, okay? And I kind of like frame number 24, and I'm gonna simulate the rest of the frames after we go through this part, okay? And then I'll show you the final render. Before I proceed, I made 3 changes to this, okay? Number 1 is the smoke object emission down here. I simulated this at as if the first frame was 2 and frame number 24 was supposed to be 1, but I changed it to 2, and then in frame 25 it'll go down to 0. Okay, that's the first change. The second change, which is a big one, is that I originally added an icosphere, okay, but in my original file I actually changed the cube to the smoke object. And obviously I added the subdivision the same as icosphere. Okay, so what I did was I went ahead and deleted the isosphere, added a cube, and I converted that and put that in there. Nothing else changed really. Literally all of the settings, its position and its size, everything is identical. Okay, so the third change is domain size. Okay, so what I did was, if I go into edit mode here, I tightened it up a lot more. Okay, so I tightened it up in such a way that it's very close to the camera, okay, because we don't need any more than that. And one of the important things I do want to point out is the fact that I actually, if I go to front view here, that's our source emitter, and I've set it up in such a way that this domain container actually clips that ever so slightly. Okay, and that's important because the Blender, in Blender at least, the emitters seem to get a lot of fluid on the back as well, so I want to cut that out. Okay, so that's the 3 changes for you. Okay, so let's move straight on to our material and setting up our rendering, etc. Okay, I just chose let's see here, I'll choose frame number 24, or in fact, you know what, I'll start with frame number, I don't know, 17 or something, because it's slightly better or smaller, you know, to load up. Anyway, so there you go. All right, okay, so I'm going to go to shading here. All right, and I also want to change this here to timeline. Okay, so we have timeline right here. Okay, so let me set this to camera. And the first thing you'll notice is that this comes up like that. I'm just going to change it to this, but we have a problem. This is not what I expected, so I'm just going to put it back to wireframe. Go to the render tab here, or render properties tab, change the render engine to cycles, and device to GPU compute. Okay, and if I go to preferences, I have GeForce RTX 2080 Ti and 2080 Max-Q. All right, and I've selected optics here. Okay, it's important you select that as well. All right, good. So let's now hit our first render. Okay, so that's what comes up, which is fine. Also, if I go in here, I want to go to that one. Actually, just select render region only, and I don't know what that is, but I'll select that as well. All right, good. So it just renders this part, not the whole thing, wasting GPU time, etc., etc. Okay, so first thing is I'd like to give a material to Suzanne. Okay, so let's start with that. Click new and go in here. I'm just going to choose a base color, which is like sort of a golden yellow type of thing. Yeah, that should be sufficient. I'm going to bump up the metallic and bring the specular down, and the specular roughness down as well. Maybe a little more. Okay, yeah, that should be okay, I guess. That's really us done with Suzanne, really. Let's now move on to the smoke domain itself. All right, so smoke domain, I want to point out that lighting is extremely critical when you're trying to light up smoke. Okay, for an example, at the moment, if there are no lights, that's how it's going to look like. And the way the smoke looks or the aesthetics of smoke is really defined by the light, and it's imperative you get the lighting right. And that's why I said these 3 lightings at the start. Okay, so that's your first one, the top left fill, and then the bottom left fill, and then the key light, or the main light, I suppose. You know, I don't have a front light here, but it's okay. I don't care about that. I only care about the smoke. So not too concerned about Suzanne's face as such. All right, so that's out of the way. Let's go back to smoke domain here. First thing I want to do is bring down the density. Okay. In fact, you know what? Before I do that, I'm gonna have to choose a world. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that right now. So Shift A, environment texture, drop it in, connect the color, and you get this, whatever that is. I'm gonna go ahead and select an environment map, and I'll come back. Okay, so this is a Video Copilot HDRI collection. Okay, you got to pay for this, but you can get free HDRIs from hdrihaven.com. All right, so go check it out. All right, good. And this is too light for my taste. Okay, so I'm gonna put in a gamma here, and bump up the gamma to 2.2, so it gets darker, so we can isolate our smoke. Really, that's the idea behind it. Okay, let's go back to smoke domain now. The only 2 things that I changed here are the density, okay, which is from 5 to 4, and the next one is the color. I'm going to bump this all the way up to 1, and that's about it really. And I deleted these temperature and temperature attribute because we're not using it. We don't need it because this is smoke, and that's really all I did for the actual smoke itself. Okay, no fancy stuff. Obviously the key is in the lighting. Okay. But I do want to point out here that if I just zoom in a little bit here, it's completely overexposed. Okay, and that's a big no. Usually I use ACES color space, but in this one I'm not. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the render properties, and down here at the color management, you see view transform from standard to filmic, and watch here when I change this from standard to filmic. Wow, that's incredible, in my opinion at least. That has really brought that down. It's almost like it's an HDR ACES transformation by itself. So I love it. There you go. That's the trick behind that. All right, good. Let's now move on to let's see here, the rest of the render properties. Okay, because you know what, I'm gonna do a render first. Let's do a render, and I will come back. Okay, before I do the render, I actually forgot one thing is I want to change this to 50% resolution. I don't want too much, and I also want to adjust preliminary settings here in the render. The first one being max samples. I don't want 4096, I just want 1024. But the minimum samples, I'd like 128. Okay, and I'd also like to set up a time limit, and this is in seconds, so I'll give it 2 minutes, which is 120 seconds. All right, and now let me go ahead and do a render, and I'll come back. Okay, I've done a render now. I decided to change the frame to 22 because I kind of like this one. So it took 49 seconds for the render to finish, and it already looks pretty darn good if you ask me. Right, so I'm going to change this to slot 2, and let's go and set up some of these render settings here. It's going to be basic settings, nothing fancy. So I want to enable denoise here for a viewport. Just going to select it to optics. Start sample as 1 is fine. Noise threshold is 0.01. I want to change it to 0.02 because that's what I set in the original render, and it turned out just fine. The next one is the render denoiser itself, and with this one I'm going to choose optics as well. For people with GTX cards, denoiser isn't going to work. Okay, so you can ignore this part. Unfortunately, it's only compatible with RTX cards. In advanced section, I'm not going to change anything here. Light paths, I'll come to that later. I'm going to disable the reflective and refractive caustics because we don't have any glass here. I'm not going to enable fast GI approximation, but I will show you what it does later. Step rate render. This will give you a lot more detail if you reduce it. For an example, if you change this to 0.5, you get twice as much of detail, okay? But to be honest, I've tried this before. It doesn't really make much of a difference, at least for 1080p HD. And when you reduce this, you'll have to pay a lot of time towards the render. Okay, I'm gonna leave it as it is. Motion blur is not supported yet in volumes in Blender. Next is film. I'm not going to choose any of that because I usually do take transparent, but I'd like my background here in this case, so I'm not going to do that. Performance, auto detect works very well, but sometimes it doesn't. So in this case, it does work well, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. And with the cycle X, this is the new tile size, which makes it appear like it's progressive rendering, but you can reduce it to whatever you want. But bear in mind, this time limit here of 2 minutes is per tile. So if you bring this down to 128, the time limit will only max out per tile. Therefore, if it has 10 tiles, it will allow it to render for 20 minutes. Okay, so be careful with that. At least that's my understanding. All right. I usually check these things, but I'm not going to do that this time. It's actually okay. You know, it's a small render, so it's all right. Make sure your view transform is definitely filming, okay? Because it does bring down that overexposed areas. So very good. That's about it. And let's go to here. In this one, yeah. So I want to change. I'm going to render PNG. Okay. I usually do multi-layer EXR, but in this case, I'm just going to do PNG. Just like the first one as well. My original was done with PNG, but the compression, I'm going to give it 50%. So if I hover the pointer over, it says amount of time to determine best compression. 0 equals no compression. With fast file output, 100 means maximum lossless compression. So I'm going to give it 50. Okay, that's only fair, I guess. Okay, so that's all that. So I'm not going to render any passes, but you should. You know, especially if you're using it on a background, you would definitely want to use passes, okay? But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to skip the rest of these things. I'm just going to check the camera here one more time. So this is 135 millimeter. That's good. Okay, so I'm just going to click on that for a second, and I want to show you something. This max bounces here, okay? It means how many bounces is a light allowed to have when it passes through a medium. For an example, in our case, it is volume. So at the moment, the light hits our volume and doesn't get bounced off anywhere. It just finishes off there, okay? So maybe you should watch this space right here at the bottom, okay? I'm going to push this up to 4 and watch it. Suddenly it became so bright, and it's an important concept to understand. In real life, light will scatter through the smoke, and that's how it is, and we have to put that in there. So although it looks too white at the moment, I think it's really good, you know. I love it. It looks more like a bong, as one of the artists mentioned in reddit.com. It does, I suppose. All right, I'm gonna close this off, okay? I'm gonna do the next render and I'll come back. Okay, rendering is finished now. That's how it looks, and I'm gonna select slot 1 now. As you can see, this is without any bounces within the volume, and this is with 4 bounces, okay? It's probably too much, so I'm gonna drop it down to 2, okay? Because I like these contours a lot, so I'm gonna drop it down to 2, and I'm gonna render it again, and I'll come back. Okay, I rendered it now, okay? So this is slot 1 with no bounce at all, and this one was with 4 which is slot 2, and slot 3 is with 2, and slot 4, which I decided to do, is with 1 bounce. So if I change it to slot 1 versus 4, 1 versus 4, okay? So I like the contours a lot, yet I would like to have some scattering going on, so I decided to go with 1 bounce. Okay, so it's kind of a win-win for me. So that looks pretty cool in my opinion. And please bear in mind also that the render time was originally 49 seconds. With 1 bounce it's 52, so there is a slight increase in render times. Okay, with 4 bounces it was 1 minute and 18 seconds. So obviously the more bounces it has to calculate, the longer it takes. Okay, but I'm happy with slot 4, which is max bounce 1. Okay, I'm just gonna switch to slot 5 and let's move on. I actually want to just enable this one now, and I'm gonna check this fast GI approximation, and I want to show you what it does. It basically brings the max bounces down to 1. Okay, at least that's my understanding. All right, so maybe you won't have any impact right now, okay, but I'll enable it now. There you go. I don't think I saw any. I'm going to disable that. I don't want that with our stuff. As I mentioned here, step rate render, you can reduce it. Honestly, I did not find any difference. I'm also going to try and use these things now. Okay, so use spatial splits. So it's longer build time but faster render. So I'm going to check this box now, and I'm also going to check this persistent data box, which I believe was introduced in 2.93. I've not seen that before that. Okay, so those are the only 2 things I'm going to enable now, and I'm going to go ahead and do another render and I'll come back. Okay, the rendering is done now. It's 51 seconds compared to slot 4, which is 52 seconds. Honestly, not much of a difference. However, maybe it makes a huge difference when you render animation. So I don't know. I'll leave it as it is, and I'm going to go ahead and do a full render now. Not 1080p render, but 50% with this resolution here, and I'll show you, and let's see how that goes. Okay, the renders are done now. I ended up doing 3 renders, 40 frames each. Before I show you the renders, I had to make a couple of changes. Number 1 is I had to uncheck persistent data from the final render because it was giving me artifacts. It was coming up with the black bars half the way on the renders on some frames and not on the others. So it was just an artifact. It was a pain. Maybe this is a bug in version 3.0. I'm not sure. So I had to uncheck that. And the next one is up here. I had to change the color depth to 16. For some reason it was set to 8. I'm not sure. I think default is 16. I also changed the color to RGB because I don't have, or I don't need any alpha. So I didn't want to waste space by using RGBA. Okay, so I changed it to RGB, and that's all. The 2 changes. Let me show you the renders now. Okay, so there are the 3 renders. I just want to show you what the differences are. The first one is basically the smoke color being 1, and our max volume bounce is set to 1. Okay, and that's the first one. Okay, so I'll play it so that you can watch it. So that's the first one, and the second one is I changed the color to 0.8 in the red, green, and blue to compensate for the brightness, because I changed the volume bounce to 4. Okay, that's the second one here. Okay, and the third one, basically I changed the color back to 1 and I set the volume max bounce to 0. Okay, so that is that. Okay, let me run all 3 in parallel if I can. Okay, so you can see that the bottom right hand corner smoke is a lot darker compared to the one on the top left and the middle as well. Okay, so the middle one is the one with max bounce of 4, and the top one is our original setup with color being 1 and max bounce set to 1. I actually kind of like the top left corner here. That's basically it. I mean, it's obviously your liking, whatever you prefer. You know, you can set it up, and certainly you can compensate using the color, dropping the color down a little bit, you know, so you can compensate for the brightness. Right. That's the end of this tutorial. If this video helped you, if you liked it, please give me a like, thumbs up, and comment. If you feel generous, subscribe. And if you feel very happy, please check out my Gumroad page. I really appreciate it. All right. See you in the next one then. Bye.